Look, it wasn't some butcher job. No crazy slasher stuff like that OJ circus. She just flat alling off the nasty crime to pulling on nas. Ever seen? Aileen Wuornos, Florida. They punched her ticket on October 9th, 2002. October 9th, 2002, Stark, Florida. Inside Florida State Prison at 9:47 that morning, Aileen Carol Wuornos finally faced a knee on death row for over a decade. News vans were lined up at the gates, all over a story that had the whole country hooked. Since the early 90s, the cops officially pinned 7 bodies on her, all found along those Florida backroads. Her last words were short and sweet, but the mess she left behind is still a huge topic for true crime fans today. Aileen didn't start out as some highway killer. She was born in Michigan back in 1956, and let's just say she was dealt a bad hand from day one. Her old man was behind bars and died there, and her mom hit the road not long after she was born. She and her brother grew up with their grandparents in a house that was anything but stable. By the time she hit her early teens, she was already done with school. She was living out in the woods, basically hustling just to get a meal and a place to crash. If you look at her rap sheet from back then, it's full of petty stuff and her trying to make it on own way too early. In her 20s, Aileen was just drifting, hitching rides, sleeping under the stars, and picking up strangers just keep some cash in her pocket. Records from Michigan to Colorado show she was always in trouble. Drunk and disorderly, bad checks. She even tried marriage in 1976 to this older guy, Louis Fell, but that fire burned down just a couple months. With no real job and nobody watching her back, she just kept bouncing between towns, living life on the shoulder of the road. By the mid-80s, she landed in Florida and hooked up with Tyria Moore, who was working as a... They stuck together for years, moving from one dive modal to the next. It was the only real thing he ever had. Every dime they had came from Aileen meeting guys on the road and charging them for her time. Down the line, Moore would be the one to flip and help the cops nail her. The first body turned up in December 1989. Richard Mallory, this 51-year-old guy who owned a tech shop, just vanished while driving across state. They found his car dumped, and days later, his body was in the brush in Volusia County. He'd been hit by multiple bullets. At first, the feds thought it was just a stick-up gone sideways. Florida was wild back then with highway crime, so it was hard to tell if this was something special or just something special. Then in June 1990, they found David Spears out in the middle of nowhere in Citrus County. Same deal. After that, the bodies started piling up in a way that the cops couldn't ignore. 5 more victims turned up across different counties over the next few months. Charles Cams Chiburis, Dick Honbresses, and Walter Antonio. All 7 of them had been gunned down, and their rides were either ditched or gone for good. Since the bodies were scattered all over the place, different precincts were running their own shows, which slowed things down. But everything chan with Farah Changcham's abandoned car. People saw 2 women booking it from the wreck after it crashed. The cops put out a sketch, and it did take long for folks to point the finger at Aileen and Tyria. They found Aileen's prints in the car, and since she already had a record, it was a total match. By January 1991, the heat was really on. They caught up with her at the Last Resort bar in Volusia. She hung out there a lot, and they took her without a fight. Tyria was scared of going down for it too, so she started talking to the cops. To stay out of jail, she made some recorded calls to Aileen, basically baiting her into coming clean. Over a few days, Aileen spilled everything on tape, saying the whole thing was her and her alone. When the detectives started digging, Aileen swore every single hit was self-defense. She claimed those guys tried to hurt her, and she was just doing what she had to do to survive. But the lawyers weren't buying it. Her story didn't match the crime scenes at all. There weren't any scratches on her, and the way she was boosting their stuff and dumping cars, live a professional hustle, not a freak out. Those pawn shop receipts with her prints tied her right to the victim's jeer. 1992 started with her first trial over Richard Mallory's death. Paperwork later showed Mallory had a real history of getting violent. Still, the jury heard that his past didn't give her a free pass. Lawyers used Florida rules to show the other hits, proving she knew what she was doing. That call turned into the nastiest fight of the entire trial. The jury heard her taped confessions and talk from the pawn shop guys. Plus lab techs matched the lead and guns to the scenes. People testified she was flat broke and relied on roadside hookups for cash. Moore took the stand, deshane on their life and the lead up to the bust. Her lawyers argued years of trauma made her see every John as a lethal threat. Shrinks gave a bunch of conflicting reports. Some called her messed up but aware, others saw deep, long-term damage. They tagged her with Murder One and Death Row. Then the other trials started. Between losing or giving in, she ended up with 6 death sentences. When appeals started, she quit helping, saying she just wanted it all over. Her legal team kept fighting anyway on technicalities. They questioned her sanity, those evidence rules, and if she was fit for trial. Courts shot them down while the public got obsessed. Documentaries started popping up. Books and news made her the most famous female killer in the country. 2003's flick Monster hit screens after she was gone. It fueled the fire about how her rough past pushed her over. Some blamed her hellish childhood. Others just saw the bodies and cold facts. By 2001, she told everyone she was done fighting the clock. Florida made Shrinks check if she knew what dying meant. They said she was fine. Once the legal road ended, they finally picked her day to die. October 9th, 2002, she passed on a last meal for a quick snack. Witnesses said she stayed cool walking in. Her last words were some weird future talk. Then the needle hit. A few minutes later, the state called it. People's reactions were just as split as they'd been for a decade. Half saw justice, the rest thought her trauma and mental state got ignored. Legally, though, it's the most detailed serial killer file in Florida's history. From that first abandoned car in 1989 to the final gavel 10 years later, every clue painted a picture of cold, planned hits along the Florida interstates. And on that October morning in Stark Prison, the long hunt ended with Florida's final act. Next up, Velma Barfield, 1984, right past midnight inside Central Prison. 52-year-old Velma walked in steady, only speaking to give a quick prayer. Minutes later, she was the first woman in America to die by lethal injection. A big moment born from a secret, deadly streak found after one shocking autopsy. Velma's road started in rural Robeson County back in 1932. She grew up dirt poor in a house with zero wiggle room. Neighbors remember a quiet kid who never caused trouble or talked back to adults. She married young for some peace, but her first run with Thomas Burke was rough. Burke was a drunk, and Velma got hooked on pills, making life way worse. Constant shouting and late nights defined their toxic marriage. Unresolved stress led to a 1969 house fire. Burke didn't survive. Cops ruled it an accident. Velma, widowed with 2 kids, moved on. No foul play was found, so the file was just closed. She remarried soon after, but debt and a pill habit trashed that too. Velma started hitting up family for cash and ghosting them. Bills piled up while she played the sweet, patient lady. She didn't look stressed, but those money woos became the state's smoking gun. By the mid-70s, Velma found work as a private home nurse. Her soft voice sold it. Families trusted her with their elders. Then her mother, Lily Bullard, caught a sickness that moved fast. Gut cramps and a quick decline ended her in March 1977. Nobody questioned it given her age. Then came 1978. Velma hooked up with Stuart Taylor, a chill tobacco field worker. Around town, they looked like a solid match. Neighbors hoped he'd ground her, but her money problems were exploding. She was broke and caught forging Stuart's name on a check. Once Stuart saw the fraud, he got violently sick out of nowhere. It was brutal, nonstop vomiting and a total physical collapse. Doctors thought it was a bug. He rallied, then crashed hard. He died February 3rd, 1978. His family demanded an autopsy. That move exposed everything. Toxicology found his blood full of arsenic. A murder probe started immediately. Detectives started asking exactly who was fixing his plates. They checked his visitors, but the heat landed squarely on Velma. When the law dug deeper, those old funerals looked suspicious. Nobody blinked then, but the pattern of deaths was impossible to ignore. They exhumed Lily Bullard, her mom, and found the same poison. Prosecutors initially only focused on the case against Stuart. The exhumation proved a pattern. Velma played innocent, but facts were cold. Arsenic was just common rat killer back in the day. Both victims had levels way too high for an accident. Linking the check to a motive, they charged her with murder. Court proceedings started in December 1978. She sat stone-faced while witnesses relived Stuart's death. The timeline was clear. A fake check, a rocky romance and a sickness matching poison. Experts explained how that toxin shreds a human body. The coroner proved he'd swallowed a massive, lethal dose. The state argued she spiked his food or drinks with powder. Family testified about her money stress and pill habit, exposing her. Witnesses recalled her hovering over the beds of the dying. It looked like kindness until the labs revealed a darker truth. Her lawyers blamed her mental breakdowns for the whole mess. They argued her drug use meant she wasn't thinking straight. They tried blaming bad food, but the experts shot that down. Testing proved Taylor was loaded with arsenic. The jury didn't blink before coming back with a bag. Velma Barfield got slapped with a death sentence. The case blew up nationwide because executing women was practically unheard of since '76. She spent years trying to beat the system through the courts. She claimed her lawyers messed up by ignoring her mental state and missed some big facts. The Cook facts. Every single plea for mercy hit a dead end. While sitting in a cell, Velma did a total 180 and found religion. She started preaching to other inmates and got church folks backing her, making everyone think she was a brand new woman. But still, the state argued the murder was cold and calculated. So the needle was fair. The public could it real. Half the crowd thought she'd truly changed. Wow. The rest just saw a stone-cold killer and the law killer. Weeks before the end, her crew begged the governor for a break, citing her age and her clean prison record. After looking at the paperwork, the governor basically said no dice and let the clock run out. On the night of November 1st, 1984, they walked Velma to the room right next chamber. She spent her final hours praying with a preacher and saying her goodbyes to the family. She skipped the big fancy final meal, just grabbing a light snack earlier that evening instead. When it was time, she walked in on her own power. Witnesses said she looked calm on the gurney while asking for forgiveness. They pushed the chemicals just after 2 a.m., and she was gone within minutes. That execution was a massive turning point in the American legal game. She was the first woman to get the needle and the first lady put down in the States since 1962. For years after, law nerds and historians kept digging into what happened to her. Some saw it as a messy mix of being hooked on drugs and mental issues and personal choice. Others said it proved that lab science can catch killers. Think. But at the heart of the mess was a guy whose sudden sickness finally blew her cover. If Stuart Taylor's family hadn't demanded that autopsy, Velma might have kept on killing. That early morning in Raleigh closed a book that started with one toxic report. Carla Faye Tucker out in Texas was executed February 3rd, 1998. That night, Texas was ready to kill a woman, first time in a century. They marched Carla into the execution room after 14 long years of court wars, non-stop news cameras, and a massive fight for her life that folks around the globe were watching. Preachers, human rights groups, and big-shot celebrities were all trying to save her, but every judge said no, and at 6:45 p.m., the state finished the job. To see how she ended up there, you gotta look at Houston in 1959. She grew up in a house full of cows and zero rules. By the time she was a teen, she was running with bikers and getting high on heavy stuff. Her record showed she was a young Runa with a habit. She ditched school early on, stayed out for days at a time, and let the street life become her only family. Through the late 70s, she was just a drifter, hopping between biker dens and working random jobs to get by. The only person who really stuck by her was a guy named Danny Garrett. Danny was a regular in the Houston biker scene, and their whole world was druddies and drugs parties. By 1983, being broke and hooked on the needle pushed them toward a crime that would ruin their lives. It all started as a simple hit on Juneteenth, 1983. Tucker and Danny thought this guy, Jerry Dean, was living in a Houston flat after stealing some bike parts from their friend. Court papers say they went over there late at night just to take their stuff back. What they didn't know was that a lady named Deborah Thornton was in there too, just sleeping off too. Tucker and Garrett slipped inside, but a quick robbery turned into a total slaughter. Forensics proved it was a hell of a fight. Garrett cracked Dean's skull with a hammer early on. The Tucker snatched up a nearby pickaxe and just started hacking away at Dean and Thornton like A&E. They took off, leaving both victims bleeding out and near death. They grabbed some gear and tried to act like nothing happened back at home. Dean's buddy showed up for their carpool the next day and saw the door smashed in. Cops knew immediately this was a nasty double killing. Seeing the place wrecked from a brawl, detectives hit the streets, talking to bikers, and everyone kept dropping Tucker and Garrett's humps. The folks started talking about how the pair was bragging about the whole messy night. Those street stories became the main proof against them. Cops moved fast and had both of them in handcuffs within weeks. Under the lights, Tucker cracked and told the cops she did hit both of them. What she said lined up with the blood at the scene, pinning her to the hit. Garrett got hit with charges too but died behind bars later. Tucker's trial started April 19. The D broke down the whole timeline, from the break-in to the bloody pickaxe work. They proved every hit she landed was meant to be fatal. The state called in snitches who heard her talk and experts to explain the wounds. The DA argued this wasn't just a job gone bad. Tucker chose to be a killer. Her lawyers admitted she was there, but begged the jury to look at her drug habit and the crazy life she led. They stressed her rough upbringing in a world where drugs and violence were just everyday life. Still, the proof was just too heavy for the jury to ignore. They found her guilty of murder and handed down the death penalty. She headed to Mountain View. That's the Texas lockup for women on death row, and nobody thought she'd become a world sensation. But as the years ticked by, she turned her whole life around. She got deep into the Bible, talked with preachers, and started saying she was truly sorry. Even the guards said she was a model prisoner who never caused any trouble. Christian groups noticed her change, and by the early 1990s, she was a household name. When she talked to the press, she looked like someone who'd totally buried her dark past. People started debating if being a new person should save a killer from the needle. Her story sparked massive debates about forgiveness and paying for one's sins. Lawyers fought for her through the mid-90s, using her change of heart as their main weapon. They begged for a lighter sentence, pointing out her perfect record and her tears of regret. Higher courts looked at all the paperwork and just kept saying no. No legal move could change the clock on her sentence. As the date neared, the push for mercy went wild. Famous preachers flooded Texas with letters, begging them to call the whole thing off. Human rights groups from everywhere sent petitions, saying she was a textbook case of someone truly changed. National news blew up, and regular folks were completely divided on the case. Half the people saw a saint, while the other half saw a killer who needed to pay. In January 1998, the Texas board sat down to decide her fate. Despite the massive public outcry, the board voted unanimously to let the execution proceed. It landed on the governor's desk next, and he gave it a hard no too. With no cards left to play, the February 3rd execution date was set in stone. On her final morning, they moved Tucker from Mountain View straight to the death house in Huntsville. She spent her final hours talking with preachers and kin. People there said she looked totally heading tolink on the death room. When they gave her the mech, she just sent love and said sorry to her folks and the victims' families. At 6:45 p.m., they hit the plunger, and a few minutes later, she was gone for good. Out past the prison gates, everyone was arguing about whether this was right or wrong. Some folks said the law did its job. Others felt the state ignored how much she had actually changed. Carla Faye Tucker's story is still one of the biggest female death row cases people talk about. It really forced folks to look at whether people can change and how the public sees them. Plus, it blurred the lines between being sorry and paying the ultimate price. Her memory still messes with how the system and regular people view prisoners, turning their lives around. Betty Lowe Beats, Texas, put to death February 24, 2000, pushing 7 p.m. This 62-year-old grandmother was being marched into the death house at the Walls unit. After 14 years of fighting and global headlines, Texas finally pulled the trigger for that her husband, Jimmy Dund. Big-name groups like Amnesty and the United Nations were begging the state for mercy. They claimed her past trauma got ignored, but she had run out of road. Every door was slammed shut. Once they started the drip, it was over in just a couple minutes. To get why Betty Lowe ended up there, you gotta look way back at the mess that was her life. Born in North Carolina in 1937, she grew up poor, unstable, and always in a fable. She bailed on school as a kid and was already wearing a wedding ring by 15. Over the next few decades, She went through 4 husbands like water before finding number 5. Every single guy was the same, controlling, moody, and just plain bad news for her. Records show she was treated like dirt since childhood, but the jury never heard a lick of it. By the early 80s, Betty was living out in Henderson County, Texas. She was scraping by on disability, and whatever family could toss her way. Money was always tight. In 1982, she hooked up with Jimmy Don Beats, a loudmouth ex-firefighter from Dallas. People who knew them said the honeymoon ended before it even started. They were constantly at each other's throats, mostly over their empty wallets. The house was a war zone. Then on August 6, 1983, Jimmy Dunn just vanishes. They found his boat floating out on Lake Athens, engine humming and gear ready, but no Jimmy. The cops figured he just fell overboard and drowned. Simple accident, right? Divers hit the water, but they found zero, with no proof of foul play. The case just sat there. Betty did not wait long to start asking about his pension and insurance, which definitely raised some brows later. 2 years go by without a peep. Then in 1985, her grown son Robert spills everything. He told the law his mom made him help bury a body in the backyard right after Jimmy disappeared. The cops showed up with a warrant and started tearing up the yard. What they pulled out of the dirt flipped the whole case upside down. Buried under a storage shed, they found Jimmy Don with a bullet hole in his skull. That lake accident was a total setup, but the digging did not stop there. While they were tossing the yard, they stumbled onto another set of remains. This one was her ex, Doyle Barker, who had been missing for years. Now the DA had a pattern. Turns out, hiding bodies was just how Betty Lowe handled her problems. They busted her in 1985, and the evidence against her started piling up fast. Experts matched a gun from her house to the lead they pulled out of Jimmy Dunn. Even her own kids took the stand to talk about what really happened that night. The prosecutors said she popped him while he was chilling in his chair, then made her kid hide him. They painted her as a cold killer who just wanted that insurance check and the pension money. The trial kicked off in Henderson County back in 1986, with the state painting her as a cold-blooded planner. They swore she didn't just pull the trigger. She rigged the whole boat accident to make a murder look a freak tragedy. The feds showed she was already chasing the insurance check before the guy's body even hit the bottom. Check this, they even dragged up Doyle Barker's bones to show this wasn't her first rodeo, even if those charges can stick. Her lawyers were fighting a losing game, claiming her whole life was just one long nightmare of being controlled by monsters. They argued you couldn't judge her without knowing the hell she'd lived through. But when it mattered, the jury didn't hear a damn thing about her past. No shrinks, no trauma experts. Nobody explained what that kind of abuse does to a person's head. They skipped the psych reports too, leaving her motives completely in the dark. Later on, new lawyers called that move a total disaster and a massive hole in the case. The jury didn't take long to come back with a guilty verdict for capital murder. She got the death penalty and ended up at Mountain View, with the rest of the women on death row. For 14 years, her legal team fought every step of the way, screaming that the jury missed story. They needed the world to see the decades of sheer terror she'd survived. Even groups from overseas started making noise about her case. Amnesty International blasted the trial, saying the court ignored her shattered mental state. The fact she couldn't hear well and had been beaten down for years, the court just brushed it off. The United Nations even chimed in, basically saying the whole sentence was a raw deal. People were saying the system just didn't get the big picture. Still, every court she went to just kept signing off on her execution. They figured the evidence was too airtight. Hiding a body showed she knew exactly what she was due. The pardon board took one last look at her case in early 2000. They didn't even hesitate. Every single one of them said no. The governor slammed the door shut, and they shipped her off to Huntsville on February 24th. She looked calm walking into the chamber, just giving her family a quick message of love before love. The needle went in at 6:18 p.m., and she was gone just minutes later. Outside the gates, people were at each other's throats over whether she deserved it. Some saw it as a total fail by a system that doesn't understand how a lifetime of pain breaks a person. Either way, her story became one of the biggest talking points in death row history. It is still the main case people bring up when they talk about what's fair in court, especially when the person on trial has been pushed to the edge for their whole life. Then there is Wanda Jean Allen, executed in Oklahoma on January 11, 2001. Just past 9 at the Oklahoma pen, 41-year-old Wanda was strapped down and ready for the protesters were outside screaming for a stay, trying to stop the clock. They kept pointing to her low, eek, and the rough life she'd been dealt since she was a kid. But the court said she knew what she was doing, and by 9:21 p.m., the line went dead. That made her the first black woman the United States had put to death since 1954. Wanda didn't start out as a headline. She was just a kid from Oklahoma City. Born in '59, she grew up dirt poor with a home life that was shaky at best. Back when she was 14, a truck plowed into her, leaving her with a massive head injury. Doctors later realized that accident basically rewired her brain in the worst way possible. It messed with how she made choices and how she handled getting worked up. School was a wash, and she hit the real world without a single person in her corner. By the time she was 20, she was just trying to survive bad breaks and worse men. She stayed in the projects, constantly bouncing from one spot to another. Back in 1981, she got into a beef that left a girl named Verdell Howard dead. Wanda swore it was a total accident, but the state wasn't buying her story. She went down for manslaughter, did her time, and hit the streets again in the mid-'80s. Trying to go straight didn't work out, and she stayed stuck in the struggle. By '84, she hooked up with Gloria Leathers. That was her girl for years, but it was toxic. Everyone knew they were always at each other's necks, fueled by crazy jealousy. They'd break up and make up constantly, keeping the drama at a boiling point. Despite the blow, it's getting worse. They just couldn't quit each other. Everything hit the fan on December 1st, 1988, when they had a massive blowout at home. Gloria bailed and hit a corner store to call the law for some backup. Cops showed up, talked to both of them, and tried to cool the situation down. Gloria left with family to escape the heat, but the beef didn't die. Later, she went to the Oklahoma City Police Southeast Station to look for more help. Wanda rolled up right behind her. People nearby heard them screaming at each other. During the confrontation, Wanda whipped out a piece and shot Gloria right in the gut. Gloria dropped, and the cops scrambled to save her. She died later at the hospital. Wanda stayed put and got cuffed immediately. Detectives started grabbing statements and bagging yens. The DE argued that Wanda acted out of pure rage and envy. They stressed the point-blank shot and reminded everyone she'd killed before. The state used that 1981 conviction to show she was just getting more violent. Doctors saw she wasn't all there mentally, but nobody did a real deep dive into her head. Her lawyers barely mentioned her old brain injury or how it messed with her mind. Records later proved her brain wasn't working right, but the jury never heard how that impairment made her snap under pressure. The trial kicked off in 1989. The DE brought in witnesses and forensics to prove she meant to kill that woman. They made Wanda look like a killer who solved every problem with a gun. The defense argued it was an impulsive mistake, but they lacked any expert testimony. The jury couldn't understand how her broken mind processed stress. Wanda took the stand, but her struggle to speak clearly totally backfired. Prosecutors twisted her words to make it seem like she was playing games. The jury hit her with murder one and called for the needle. The judge signed off, and Wanda headed to death row at Mabel Bassett. Once she was locked up, activists and mental health groups took notice. A new legal team dug into her past and found medical proof ignored at trial. New brain scans showed real damage from when she was a teenager. Amnesty International dropped reports saying she was way too impaired, and that her original lawyers completely dropped the ball on the evidence. Filmmaker Liz Garbus captured her final days in a doc that got the whole country talking. It showed two sides, the DEA calling it murder, and advocates saying the law ignored her broken mind and the life that shaped her. All through the 90s, her team kept fighting in every court they could find. They argued the trial was a sham because the jury lacked the full story. Her team pushed the idea that Wanda could grasp the weight of her choices, claiming her mental state was far worse than the jury ever knew. Even with those pleas, the Oklahoma Appeals Court and the feds stuck to their guns, keeping her conviction locked. They figured the proof was too solid, and her lawyers' blunders weren't enough of a reason to flip the script. As the clock ticked down to her date, they scrambled to get the parole board to show some mercy. Those documents held experts' takes on her brain health and pleas from human rights groups, all saying killing someone, like someone just wasn't right. The board looked it over but shot down the request for a break. The governor didn't budge either. January 11th, 2001. They hauled Wanda from Mabel Bassett over to the Max Security, the Matsecurit. She sat with her preachers and her inner circle at the end. Witnesses noted she looked steady walking in that chamber. For her final words, she offered a quick prayer. They started the procedure just after 9 p.m. and ever fast. Outside the wire, people were shouting for justice, while others felt the courts finally got it right. To this day, Wanda Jean Allen's name is always the first one up when people talk about death, the mental health. Her story is the go-to example in every fight about whether the system can actually be fair to broken minds. Her execution ended the legal back and forth, but it kept the fire burning on debates about who is fit for trial and how much a person's past should matter. Frances Newton, Texas. Put to death September 14, 2005, Huntsville. Just past 6 p.m. 40-year-old Frances Ellen Newton was led into the death house outside. Her fans held signs calling her innocent, while others thought the law did its job. Newton went to her grave swearing she didn't touch her husband or her 2 babies. At 6:17 p.m., Texas pulled the switch, closing the book on one of the state's biggest legal wars. To see how Frances ended up on that gurney, we gotta go back to Houston in the mid-80s. Growing up in Texas, people knew Frances as a quiet, hard-working woman who lived for her family. She tied the knot with 23-year-old Adrian Newton, and they had 2 kids, 7-year-old Alton baby Farah, who was only 21 months. By 1987, they were holed up in a cheap spot in northwest Houston, barely keeping their heads above water. Adrian was bouncing between odd jobs, and word on the street was he owed some heavy hitters for drugged. Their marriage was falling apart under the weight of empty pockets, constant fighting, and Adrian's shrine stiding. The year before the hits, Frances loaded up on life insurance. Records show $50,000 drain and smaller hits on the kits. She told everyone it was just a safety net for the family's future. But the cops didn't buy the timing. She bought those policies without Adrian knowing, and his signature in the papers became a huge mess in court. The state called it a forgery. Frances swore he was in on the deal. April 7, 1987, Houston cops rolled up to the Newton apartment and walked in tarpon. Adrian was cold on the sofa, and the 2 little ones were slaughtered in their beds. No doors were kicked in, and nothing was missing. Frances was out at a cousin's and came home to find her worm destroyed. She was a wreck, but she told the Heat right away that Adrian had beef with some bad people, guys he owed cash to, and she blamed them. Cops looked for any sign of a break-in, but the place was tine. A few days later, everything changed. Detectives hit a relative's garage, where Frances had stashed a bag. Wrapped in some rags, they found a .25 caliber heater. The lab said the lead pulled from the bodies came right out of that gun. Frances said she'd never seen, but a friend, Shirley Houston, later took the stand and said Frances asked her to buy a small piece weeks before to keep her name off the paperwork. Shirley told the jury she bought the gun and handed it right to Frances. That talk, plus the hardware they found, became the anchor for the prosecution. The feds also tore apart the insurance papers. One pro said Adrian's signature didn't look anything like his real handwriting. The state's case was simple. Frances faked the name. She grabbed the life insurance, then tried cashing in right after the hits. She pushed back, claiming she was just checking the fine print, nothing more. Trial started in October 1987. The DA claimed she popped her family just to collect the insurance cash. They showed the ballistics, the gun purchase witness, and those policy documents. They hit her for lying to cops and said she faked the scene. The defense argued the state's case was all weak guesses. They focused on her husband's shady ties, saying a debt collector did it. They ripped into how the cops handled the murder weapon, since anyone could have grabbed it. They also said the payout was way too small. Even so, the jury found her guilty of capital murder. She got death and went to the women's unit at Mountain View. For 18 years, her case was the biggest talk in Texas. Her lawyers fought the old ballistics, calling them total junk science today. New pros hinted that gun might not even be the actual murder weapon. Still, the state insisted their original findings were solid gold. People also started questioning the gunshot residue results they used. Experts said the old methods were way too easy to mess up. None of this proved innocence. But her team argued all these doubts meant that they needed a redo. They also fought over the money, Since her husband's signature looked fake, handwriting pros could agree if she forged his name. The D finally admitted he might be signed the form himself, but they still pushed the motive. Soon the whole world was watching. Pastors and activists everywhere begged the state to just slow down. They said the evidence was weak, and rushing might kill an innocent woman. Big Texas papers ran stories blasting the shaky lab work. Supporters noted she wasn't violent, and felt the state played dirty by obsessing over money while ignoring the dangerous guys he owed cash. In 2004, she was hours from execution before a last-second save. The board gave her a 120-day stay for gun tests. For months, the courts pored over the new lab results, but decided the findings didn't change anything. Every appeal was denied. By 2005, protesters used her case to slam shaky science. Legal groups begged for mercy, saying scientific doubts should stop the execution. The board said no. With no options left, the clock kept ticking. On September 14th, they moved her to the death house in Huntsville. Witnesses said she was calm, repeating she was innocent. She softly denied it. Then they pushed the drugs. Outside, the crowd reacted with pure intensity. Some felt justice won, while others said the state ignored the truth. Her case is still a Texas legend, highlighting why old lab work is risky, showing how weak guesses are, and the danger of trusting ballistics that don't hold up anymore. Today, her story still sparks heated talk among lawyers and activists. Was she a cold killer, or just a victim of a broken system? These death row cases always turn into a total emotional circus, especially with doubts lingering. Christina Marie Riggs, Arkansas, gone May 2nd, 2000. Varner, Arkansas, just past 9 at night, 28-year-old Christina walked into that final room. For a whole year, she told the judges she was done fighting the chair. Nobody does that. Her choice to just give up started a huge firestorm across the state. 9 on the dot. They pushed the meds, and she was out. The first woman Arkansas executed since the 1800s. To see how she ended up there, you gotta look at where she started. Born in Oklahoma, 1971, her childhood was just being broke and moving constantly. School sucked for her. She was shy, but eventually, she pulled it together to become a nurse. The job paid the bills, but that hospital stress was eating her alive. By the mid-90s, she packed up and headed for Arkansas. At the Little Rock Heart Clinic, she was a quiet pro, but at home, things were trashed. Her marriage was dead, the kids were a handful, and the bills were stacking up. Friends said she felt trapped, through in heavy depression, and she was basically drowning. By 1997, she hit a wall. On November 4th, the whole thing just snapped. Christina was home with her kids, 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby. Using meds from her nursing job, she gave both kids shots meant to stop their hearts. When the needles didn't finish it fast enough, she used her hands to smother them. She wrote some why notes, then tried to check herself out with a pill cocktail. She was out cold for hours. Next morning, her mom showed up since she wasn't answering. She found Christina barely breathing and the grandbabies already gone. The EMS rushed her to the ER, and she finally woke up later that afternoon. When the cops grilled her, she just spilled everything like she was reading a grocery list. She told them she'd failed as a mom and figured killing everyone was the only way. Her talk with the cops matched those suicide notes perfectly. Open and shut case. The techs found the needles, the bodies, and the pills by her bed. No break-in, no nothing. No fight, no other suspects. The D slapped her with 2 counts of capital murder. The shrink said she knew exactly what was happening and was fit for trial. Her lawyers tried to play the depression card to save her neck. Between the stress and her life tanking, they had a case, but Christina said, "Don T fight." Trial kicked off in June 1998. The state just laid out the facts, plain and simple. The needles, the pillows, the notes. They showed how she'd planned the whole nightmare. They proved she used her nurse's training to kill her own kids and then herself. Her lawyers didn't even try to argue the facts. They just talked about her head space and how she'd been spiraling for months. But the legal team hit a major wall. Christina got on the stand and said it was all on her. No excuses. She straight up told everyone she deserved the needle for what she did. Even when her team tried to say she was sick, she told them to back off. Jury said guilty. They gave her death and shipped her to the Varner unit. What happened next was the weirdest legal battle Arkansas had seen in ages. The law says every death case gets a second look, even if the killer says no. Christina pulled the plug on her defense, tossing any chance at an appeal. That forced the state high court to bring in head shrinkers to see if she was sane. The docs did their thing and said she totally got the stakes and the legal game. With that sign-off, the judges let her walk away from the whole fight. It sparked a huge blowout over whether a broken mind can sign its own death warrant. Big-name groups like Amnesty International jumped into the fray immediately. They were screaming about how wrong it was to let a depressed woman just quit. Mental health experts argued the state should have fixed her mind instead of the needle, but the law decided she was sane enough and kept the execution moving. Through '99 and into 2000, her lawyers kept banging the drum about her sanity. But Christina wasn't having it. She wouldn't lift a finger to save herself. She told everyone she'd rather die than rot in a cell forever. As her date with the needle got closer, people were tearing each other apart. Some wanted blood, while others said the state was assisting a suicide. Critics called the ordeal a massive failure for a woman in total agony. Come May 2nd, 2000, they hauled Christina to the Cummins unit for the end. Her final hours were dead quiet. Some prayer, no big speech, and zero drama. Witnesses said she looked eerily calm while they cinched the straps. At 9 p.m., the chemicals hit her veins while a small crowd waited outside. To some, it was just a closed case. Justice served plain and simple. To others, it raised questions about where the state's duty to protect really ends. Even years later, the Riggs case is the first thing people bring up in debates. Legal bigwigs are still fighting over whether someone that broken can actually give up. Her story is the go-to evidence when talking about the limits of autonomy. It's the ultimate lesson in what happens when serious depression goes untreated. The case is a messy look at someone begging the government to kill them. Those deep ethical scars she left behind are still being picked at today. Federal case Lisa Montgomery, executed January 13th, 2021, in Terre Haute. Before dawn, 52-year-old Lisa was already strapped down and ready. Lawyers worked overtime for months, trying every trick to stop the feds. They argued her shattered mind and brain injuries meant she shouldn't be killed. But the final stay was yanked at 1:31 a.m., ending a 60-year streak. Lisa's life didn't start under bright courtroom lights. It started in the dark. Born in '68 in Kansas, she grew up in pure chaos with zero love. Reports after she got busted showed a woman who had been broken for decades. Her childhood was a factory for some of the worst psychological trauma imaginable. We're talking about a fractured mind and brain damage confirmed by real tests. She brought those demons into her adult life. Bad marriages and total loneliness. By the early 2000s, Lisa was holed up in Melbourne, Kansas. Family said she lived in a fantasy world, faking stories about being pregnant. When life got heavy, she'd slip away into fake stories until reality vanished. Shrinks saw it as a desperate way to survive her childhood nightmares. By 2004, Lisa started lurking on dog breeding boards and chat rooms all day. She hit up some online forums and found Bobby Joe Stinnett, a 23-year-old raising dogs in Moore, Missouri. They started chatting about terrier pups, and when the next litter was due, Bobby Joe was totally clueless that Montgomery was feeding her family this huge lie about being another fake pregnancy, exactly like the others she'd staged. Feds later noted how her obsession with that lie set the whole nightmare in motion. On December 16, 2004, she cruised from Kansas to Missouri, acting like she'd buying a pup, but packing a rope and a blade. They were chatting inside when she suddenly jumped the poor girl. She choked her out, ending it right there, then cut the baby straight out of her before heading to Kansas with the newborn. She played it off like the baby was hers. Mom found her daughter just minutes later and called 911 right away. Since she de-snatched a baby and crossed state lines, the feds swarmed the case immediately. The FBI followed the digital breadcrumbs, tracing emails and web logs straight to Montgomery's front door. By the next day, agents caught her with the baby, who was thankfully still breathing and okay. In the hot seat, she stuck to her story at first, but eventually spilled details only the killer would. Forensics, like blood, that rope, the blade, and her internet history, locked the case down for the government. Her trial started in 2007. The state argued she'd mapped out this horror to keep her fake pregnancy going, pointing to the neg drone, her weapons, and everything she did after the hit. They claimed she knew exactly what she was doing. Mental she was aside. Her team didn't deny the acts, but claimed her broken mind couldn't process reality. They dumped a mountain of medical records all rose, including including scans showing a messed up brain and experts saying she'd totally detached from the real world. They said years of trauma broke her, meaning she didn't have the mindset required for a death sentence. The prosecution fired back, saying her careful planning proved she was legally on the hook. The jury deliberated and found her guilty. She got the death penalty for the kidnapping and the murder for the next 13 years. The case crawled through the appeals process. Her legal team kept fighting, claiming the first trial ignored crucial evidence about how her brain worked. A few judges admitted the case was a mess, but nobody would throw out the sentence. They kept hammering on her mental state, citing experts who found she was severely impaired and unseeable. Still, the courts ruled there wasn't enough legal ground to flip the decision. Things heated up in 2020 when the feds started executing people again after a long break. Her date was set for December, but it got pushed when her lawyers caught the virus. Activists, doctors, and even some ex-prosecutors begged the government to show some mercy. They argued that killing someone that mentally broken just wasn't right or fair in this day and age. Her lawyers made a final push, claiming she didn't even understand why they were putting her to death. So, lower courts tried to pause it, but the Supreme Court gave the green light to proceed. On the night of January 12th, she was moved to the facility in Terre Haute. People there said she was silent and totally checked out on the gurney. She didn't say a word. At 1:31 in the morning, the needles went in, and she was gone pretty quick. Outside, the crowd was split. Some folks felt she finally got what she deserved for that crime. Others argued the feds turned a blind eye to her obvious mental illness and deep-seated trauma. The whole thing sparked a huge debate over how we treat mental illness in death row cases and where the feds draw the line. Even now, people are still picking apart her case like almost no other in federal history. Experts are still arguing whether the system actually cared about her mental health or just wanted mental health. The courts think they've got a handle on the twisted stuff inside someone's head. No matter how you see it, this shook the country, sparking huge debates over deep scars and account. Looking back at these files from coast to coast over 40 years, you start seeing the same red years. And I'm not talking about the violence. Every hit is a nightmare, but look at the road there. Girls growing up in chaos, alone and hurting. Some were hooked on the junk. Others lived in fear of some psycho boyfriend. A few had their wires crossed for years with zero help, falling right through the cracks of the system. Once they stood before the judge, the reasons why they snapped were often ignored, or just never ignored. That sloppy legal work decided their fate just as much as the trigger did. Law-wise, these cases are rare, since they brought back the ultimate price in 1976. Women are just a tiny slice of those facing the needle, and even fewer actually get executed. Their stories always bring up the tough stuff, like if they're sane, the toll of abuse, and if being pushed too far changes the sentence. Plus how the law looks at intent when their brains were already fried. Prison bigwigs, high courts, and world watchers have been arguing over these rare trips to the triptych rages. So as the screen goes dark on this one big question is still hanging there. When we dig into these files, what's the real story? A court just doing its job? Or a broken machine that missed the damage done way before anyone ever pulled a knife? Maybe it's both. Facing the music on one side and years of silent hell on the other, no easy answer. Probably never will be, but I want your take. Which story hit you hardest? Which made you doubt? Was it the law or the world failing before the crime? If you're down for more gritty dives into the dark side, hit subscribe and drop a comment, and hang tight for the next file. These are not just stories of crime. They are stories of broken childhoods, silent suffering, and a world that looked away too soon. Alima, Carla, Betty, Wanda, Frances, Christina, Lisa. 8 women, 8 tragedies, not because they were born killers, but because they were failed by families, by systems, by silence. Every single one of them grew up in chaos, poverty, abuse, addiction, abandonment. Their wounds were real, their pain was real, and nobody stepped in before it was too late. Here is the truth we must face. Behind every act of violence is a story that started long before. A child who needed love and got none, a mind that needed healing and got ignored. This is not about excusing what they did. The victims matter. Their lives were precious. Justice matter. But justice without understanding is just punishment, and punishment alone has never saved a single soved. If we want fewer tragedies, we must intervene earlier. Teach empathy, fund mental health, protect child, because the real crime often begins in a home where a child cries alone. and no one comes. The question isn't just what they did. The question is, what did we fail to do for them first? Be the reason someone feels seen. Be the reason someone gets help. Be the change that breaks the cycle before it breaks a life.